All right. Professor Collins,
But,
how are you
yeah,
doing? I can see you.
and I don't have my volume up. That's the problem.
That's okay. You
Okay,
you hear
can
me
you hear me
well?
now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, good.
Yeah,
Let me
perfect.
see if I can enlarge this here. Yeah,
Yes, please.
yeah,
I just want to make sure that I have you in the right frame. So I think we're good there. Yeah.
yeah. I
Okay.
guess I could sit back a little bit,
This is official now.
where
Professor,
are you, Merv?
I am in Honduras, Central America.
Oh,
Um, just in
yeah.
the, it's in the middle of the continent. Perhaps you're not aware of that cancer because we're not that famous, just like the states. But yeah, we're right there.
Mm,
Professor Collins, thank you for coming on the show, for returning. You're no stranger to the podcast. So, and thank you for kindly accepting our invitation once again. It's an honor to have you on. How are you doing today? You doing okay?
yeah,
I understand there is a conference coming that you are taking part of. It's called New Insights in the Hebrew Bible. So, looking forward
yes.
to
It's
watching that.
it's a collection. It's a number of presentations. It's not
Okay.
a conference in the sense that we'll be interacting with each other. I think there
Oh.
will be at least one panel where a few people will be interacting, but
Hmm.
mostly we come in and do our thing and take off.
Oh,
But
I see.
still, I mean I
No,
think
no, that's okay.
as
Thank you
far
for
as
the information. Yeah.
any people logging into it are concerned, it's a little festival of of
Hmm.
biblical papers.
Yeah, I know. Actually, I think I have a picture right here, but again, thank you for the clarification because people, social media, we need to make sure that the right information is going around so people know what's going on there. Actually, I have a picture here. I would like to share for the people, the audience who's going to be watching this interview. Just so you know, I think it was posted on Bob Ehrman's social media by Megan
Yeah,
Lewis. Not sure. But it's a hell of a lineup right there. You are there, Professor Joel Bajan, Dr.
yes,
Dan McClellan, who has a strong presence on social media, which is great. Shout out to him. Also, Megan Lewis, and there's another big name there. Just let me put it right here for people.
yeah,
Uh, so there you go. Okay, let me put it
yeah.
right here.
But I guess what I meant by my clarification was, when we speak of a conference, that's often a group of scholars coming together to debate things, whereas this is
Hmm.
a group of scholarly presentations directed to the general public.
Oh,
So, the interaction isn't so much among the scholars as presenting material to the broader public. That's the
yeah,
idea behind it.
yeah. So
At
that's
least that's how I understand it.
no, I mean that's great because you just as it were you are coming out of the normal academic circles,
Yeah,
which for the most part we laymen we don't have access to it.
yeah,
So this kind of a conference is a great
yeah,
enterprise, trying to reach more a wider audience if we can
yeah,
put it that way. So that's
yeah.
awesome.
So I think
Absolutely
it's a
great.
very good thing.
Yes, it's a wonderful thing. I tell you that. Let me just put it right here very quick. I think I saw it for people who's watching there. Okay, there you go. I'm gonna share the screen and so that people can see it. And oh, there you go. Just I just want to see this one. Oh, there you go. Okay. Let me know if you can see it.
Yeah,
Oh, there you go.
yeah,
There you go. That's the one, people. So,
yes,
announcing. Oh, I just click in there. Announcing a new Bible conference, new insights into the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
March early bird
Yeah.
pricing. Yay! Keep an eye on that. Look at the lineup. Oh, there is Shauna Dolansky. I hope I'm pronouncing her right.
Yes.
Yeah. And there you are, Professor Collins, at the end of the row. Dr. Van Lewis, McClellan, and everyone else.
Yeah.
So far people is reacting to it, which is great. I hope everything works just pretty smoothly there for you guys. That's awesome. All right, let's go and talk about what concerned us here today, and that has to do with people have been asking me, okay, second time you're bringing Professor Collins to the show, what's the topic? And I said, well, that's going to be about the introduction to the Hebrew Bible, which is in the fourth edition, and for people who is not um, the like more of a picture. I want to put it right this one here up there so you can see it. So, Introduction to the Hebrew Bible, fourth edition, Professor John J. Collins. I would like to start very quickly with you, Professor Collins. The experience writing, the first edition. Do you still remember how was the first experience, writing about the Hebrew Bible? Many ideas. How was the process? Can you talk about
Oh,
that?
I have been writing on parts of the Hebrew Bible for over 50 years.
Yeah.
Mostly it's an outgrowth of teaching.
Mm.
So certainly when I came to write this introduction, which is now more than 20 years ago,
Oh yeah.
it was actually it's about 25 years ago, even maybe 26, that I had I had taught at a number of different institutions. I taught at the
Yeah.
Catholic Seminary for 5 years. I taught at DePaul University with very general undergraduate education. And then I taught at the universities of Notre Dame in Chicago before I moved to Yale. And the
Yeah.
latter ones were, higher level, more specialized. Uh, but there's certainly a common thread. One of the basic courses that one teaches, if you happen to be a professor of Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, is an introduction.
Yes.
Now, I don't know, were you yourself brought up Catholic or Protestant or what?
Well, I try to bring everybody into the conversation. I
Yeah,
have no distinctions.
well,
Yeah. This
sure,
is
yeah, but
yeah.
you're familiar, in general, if you have a classroom of conservative Protestants,
Hmm.
they know the story. That's the plus. If you
Oh,
cite a passage, they'll know where it comes from. Now, they may not be prepared to think critically about it.
yeah.
The problems will arise at the level of interpretation. With a lot of Catholic students, even many liberal Protestants, and certainly with Unitarians, they may not know the story at all, or know very
Hmm.
little of it. And that gives you a different challenge. So, and most of my career, I have had mixed classes.
Okay.
Early in my career, I had mostly Catholic students. Then at the University of Chicago, we had a big contingent of Unitarians who really didn't know the Bible at all. And, this actually also, I think, helps the teaching in a way, because the first thing you've got to do is explain the story.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
try to get everybody on the same page as to what it is that we're talking about. And then you can get on to questions of interpretation. Now, a
Hmm.
lot of the questions of interpretation will gravitate towards history because, by and large, there's a great German scholar named Gerhard von Rad who said that the Old Testament is
Yeah.
a history book, which, it isn't, but it tells a story that looks like history.
Yeah.
And so people want to know, did this stuff actually happen? And so, that means there's a lot of pressure in doing an introduction like this to deal with the historical questions.
Yeah.
Inquiring minds want to know. So you've got to tell them those things. Now, I also find, though, that in the end of the day, what really matters about the Old Testament, and probably about the New Testament too, is the ethics.
Yeah.
What are the implications for how you should act? And so in this last edition, that's the main thing, the main change I made, is I put in several excursus to, address some of the more topical issues. And a lot of those I had dealt with in another book, which is What Are Biblical Values, which was also, in a way, a spin-off from teaching this introductory course. But what does the Bible have to say about the things that people are really concerned with? So I think that, to my mind, is the more important kind of question. But you still have to get the other stuff out of the way, so to speak. You have to clear out the question, are we talking here about fact, fiction? Do we even know?
Yeah. It may seem like something that is not to be taken into account, or perhaps to the normal reader is not important. It is important.
Yeah.
It is important because the Bible didn't drop from heaven in one day, one single
Yeah.
day, and Professor Collins can attest to that better than myself. Now, Professor Collins, I want to move us to the first question, just to follow the normal dynamic here, and also because I want to be appreciative of your time. And in the first question, which is popping up on your screen, let me know if you can see it.
No, but I've seen it. Why is the importance of the ancient Near East so important? And the reason it's so important, in a nutshell, is
Oh, definitely.
this is the world that the Bible comes from.
Yeah.
Now, the Bible didn't fall onto Mount Sinai in a time capsule. It didn't just come in as timeless truth. It came in a Semitic language. That Semitic language was itself a variant of other Semitic languages, and the people who spoke that language shared a lot of the common assumptions of the time. And you have to respect that if you're going to do any kind of justice to the Bible at all. This wasn't written in the 21st century. It wasn't written with our problems in mind. It was written long ago and in a far country, and you need to find out something about that strange and distant culture if you want to understand it. So, when I used to teach the Old Testament, I always began with the ancient Near Eastern myths.
Yes. Yeah.
Because, you have to understand, how do people speak about God in the ancient world? How do they imagine the ultimate questions of life? And I don't know how familiar you are with that material, but there's a Babylonian creation story at the Enuma Elish, which becomes a battle between Marduk, the creator god, and Tiamat, who is like the watery deep. And one time, Tiamat opens her mouth to swallow him, and he shoots in arrows and then rips her apart and creates the world out of her carcass. Now, nobody in their right mind is going to say, oh yeah, that's how the world started. But, it's a way of getting at something.
Yeah.
There is some truth in it. And, the truth that it's trying to get at is that life is violent it is, in fact, often the product of clashes, conflicts, and so forth. And you got to appreciate that. So the point of doing these ancient Near Eastern stories is to give people some feel for what kind of stories you can expect to find in the Bible. Now, so, you don't pick up, the Bible is not the New York Times. It's not, and it's not Fox News either. It's not, it's not modern style reportage. It's a lot of it is just works of imagination. And if you want to talk about the creation, for example, that's the only way you can talk about it. Because, as I say, this didn't drop from heaven. Whatever you believe about the Bible being inspired or revealed, it is, in any case, written by human beings in the language of a particular time and place. Now, it could still be inspired at that and could still have great relevance for us now, much later, but you've got to respect that it is written in the language and idiom and conceptuality of a particular time and place. And that's what you start from.
Yeah, actually, you were touching on the first question because you have to include in the mix the study of the ancient Near East, which is something very important and outstanding on your introduction.
Yeah.
Now, it is important. That's the main takeaway, Professor Collins. We just can't skip it. At least, if you want to be, if we are serious students of the Bible,
Yeah.
we can skip, right? We have to make it.
Yeah. And I must say, that a lot of many evangelical Christian scholars who are quite conservative theologically also put a lot of effort into understanding the ancient Near East. And they do quite good work on that. Now, in part, that's because they're hoping that this will support the reliability of the biblical material. But be that as it may, I think they do good work when they bring this material into the conversation.
Gotcha. I'm not sure, but perhaps this is part of the same question before moving on to the second one. But at the moment that you are studying the ancient Near East to better understand your Bible, Genesis 1 through 1, primeval history and everything, do you include the term history? I mean, the main difference between history and ancient historiography. Is that important, Professor Collins, for us to read the Bible?
The main difference between modern and ancient historiography, is that it?
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's extremely important. Now, you see, what was historiography in the ancient Near East?
Yes. What was that?
They don't produce books, things even that look as much like modern history as what we get in the Bible. Now, back when I was a student, it was very popular to contrast the historical approach of the Israelites with the mythical approach of the ancient Near East. Now, I think most people have given up on that and realized that it's much more shady in between. But in Babylon and Assyria, they made lists of things, they had chronicles. They didn't usually fill out what we would call historical stories. But then they did sometimes tell quite fanciful tales. And, these two are a way of trying to capture the past. And that comes very much into play in the Hebrew Bible. Because, to possibly getting ahead here a little bit, a lot of the story of biblical scholarship over the last 50, 75 years, and maybe more, has been eroding people's confidence in the historical accuracy of the Bible.
I mean, there.
Back when I was a student in the middle of the last century, there was a great scholar, then at the end of his career, William Foxwell Albright.
Yeah.
And he taught at Johns Hopkins University, and he trained all the leading Old Testament scholars in North America in a whole generation. Now, Albright set out in the belief that archaeology would support the accuracy of the biblical text. And so his program, was both textual and archaeological. I did my PhD at Harvard. George Ernest Wright was the resident archaeologist. He was also a biblical theologian.
You got to know him, right?
Yeah. But now, this whole enterprise, we would have to say, backfired. Because if you take, for example, one of the showcase stories in the Hebrew Bible is the story of the destruction of Jericho, where the walls came tumbling down.
Yeah.
Well, when they excavated Jericho, the main conclusion was that it hadn't really been inhabited at the right time. Now, Jericho was destroyed at various times in history, but a few hundred years off from the time that we think the Israelites would have been coming into the land.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I should say archaeology is not infallible.
Oh, no.
And, you always have the possibility that somebody will have a new excavation next week and find something different.
Yes.
But at the same time, responsible scholarship goes with the best evidence we have at the moment. And you have to do that with a certain modesty. And you've got to do it in the knowledge that 50 years from now, people probably will think differently. But still, what we do is we go with the best evidence that we have at the moment. Now, the best evidence that we have at the moment was summed up by one of G.E. Wright's students, Bill Deaver. I don't know if you've ever heard the man. He's written very prolifically on the archaeology of ancient Israel. And Deaver, I would say, started out as a relatively conservative figure. But at the same time, his final conclusions on it were kind of devastating. It was that, as far as he was concerned, there is no archaeological evidence for the Exodus or the conquest.
The patriarchs, yeah.
Now, so what do you do? It's not that we now know what happened, because we don't, actually. But we have to reckon with the fact that the stories that we have are more like myths.
Yes.
That these are imaginative stories, imaginative reconstructions. They are, I think, in many cases, serious historiographical attempts. A man who was a student with me at Harvard, Baruch Halperin, wrote a very good book on the first historians, in which he argued, that these people were trying to figure out what happened. Now, in doing so, they often ended up making up stories.
Yeah.
But you see, it was more in the line of, this is how it must have happened. And then use your imagination, put flesh on those bones, and conjure up a story like the conquest of Jericho. So, it deserves respect. It's a serious attempt. But what it ultimately tells us isn't really what we call history. It's probably much more the ideology of a later generation.
I agree.
That probably gets us into the second question you had on your
Yes.
list there.
Yeah, yeah.
How
Yes.
much, what did you say, Genesis 1 to 11?
Yes.
Practically nothing. Practically nothing. Or indeed, the Exodus, you see, you will get much more controversial. But Genesis
Oh,
1 to 11, I think, only the most hard-boiled fundamentalist would want to say that Genesis 1 to 11 is historical.
no, I don't side with
This
that.
material, there are a lot of parallels with Babylonian myth, stories like the flood. This part of it was folklore, part of it, but mythology is a fair enough name for it, I think. You disappeared, by the way, off the screen, and I do want to
There you go.
see you.
There you
I like to see that I'm talking to somebody and not just talking to
go.
myself.
Okay, I
So,
just want to read the question for people who is listening only,
yeah.
Professor Collins. So basically, the question that Professor Collins is addressing now is that in terms of historicity, how much, how much of the stories found in Genesis 1 through 11, which is called primeval history in academic circles, as well as the Exodus, can be taken as historical? And how does he approach these questions in his intro? Go ahead, Professor Collins.
And, going again, like on our best evidence for the present, which may or may not turn out to be right in the long run, but it's the best we've got at the moment. Now, Genesis 1 to 11, I think, is clearly not history. You just look at the ages of the patriarchs. They're fantastic. So that, I think, pretty much, and also you have no way of correlating anything in those chapters with anything except other mythology.
Hmm.
Mythology from the ancient Near East. Now, the Exodus, you see, is a much more controversial business because there you're getting down a little bit in history. We have a fair bit of evidence about ancient Egypt. Doesn't tell us anything at all about Israelites or Israelite slaves running away. If the Exodus happened, it didn't bother the Egyptians very much. You don't get anything in Egyptian tradition about that for another 1,000 years afterwards. In a Hellenistic historian in Manetho, and he was just trying to explain where did these Jews come out of. But there are no ancient Egyptian records about the Egyptians. Now, the thing that impressed people like Bill Deaver is that we have a lot of archaeological evidence from early Israel. Now, one of the favorite things of archaeologists is pottery, because you get an awful lot of broken pieces of pottery. When I went on 2 excavations in my youth, and one
Oh,
of
you
the
did?
things that you did
Okay.
in the afternoon was learn to read pottery. Pick up a piece of pottery, look at it, and say, "This, you can date this to such and such a date." Now, again, I would now be inclined to take a lot of that with a grain of salt, but
Yeah,
be that as it may,
as we all should.
there's no Egyptian pottery in early Israel. Now, you would expect that if they had come out of Egypt, they'd have brought some pots with them.
Yeah.
No, none of this proves that some kind of an exodus didn't happen. I myself am inclined to think that there must have been some kind of an exodus. I don't think they would have made up a story that their ancestors were slaves in the land of Egypt. That's not such a glorious thing. So I think there must have been some substance to it.
Yeah.
But to judge by the archaeology, it can't have been anything like as big a deal as the book of Exodus makes it out to be.
Hmm.
Now, you see, a lot of there's a whole tradition of scholarship that would say there was a tidal wave. If you look at this picture you put up on the screen, but that, I think, that's wrong-headed.
Yeah, it's more fantasy. Yeah.
That's it's taking an account that's poetic,
Yeah. Yeah.
imaginative,
Yeah.
fantastic, and trying to make it literal.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
in a way, that's what they do also in the Bible. Because my old friend Baruch Halpern, one of his examples is in chapter 15, you have a poem about the crossing of the Red Sea, about how the Egyptians Pharaoh and his army were drowned in the Yam Suf, the Red Sea.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, this is most probably a poetic way of saying they were completely overcome, completely undone. But then whoever wrote Exodus chapter 14 wanted to extract history out of that. And so he tried to break it down into a much more detailed story where you have where dry land appears and they walk across on the dry land and so forth. Now, this is a good faith attempt to squeeze history out of poetry. But, in a lot of cultures, and I'm sure this is true in Honduras as well as everywhere else,
go
what
ahead.
you have about the past are songs and ballads and epic stories. And then if that's all you have, and somebody tries to write a history on the basis of that, you may end up with some fairly far-fetched details.
Yeah.
And, this is true in every country, I think.
And I was about to give an example, a quick example here. We have an indigenous hero. It's called Lempira. That's the way you say in Spanish, Lempira. Actually, showing up on one of my in our currency. But what I want to tell you is that people, historians, writing about this indigenous hero, they they often embellish stories. They come up with embellished stories about him.
Sure, they do. Yeah.
They do, yeah. So I'm with you. Practically everybody's doing that in their own stories and myth tale and folk tale and everything.
Now,
And personalization.
Yeah, one of the interesting developments in recent scholarship, I'm not sure in the end how much it helps, but it's interesting. And that is to look on these stories as products of memory. Now, you might think, if it's memory, they're remembering what actually happened. But if you stop and think about it, an awful lot of what we remember never happened at all. Just in our own lives, even. You get 5 witnesses to an event, and they'll probably give you different accounts of it.
Different versions, yeah.
Now, but that is the way these stories originated. And I would think in most cases there was something that got it going. But it's not much point now to trying to just figure out what that something was. In a way, you can see what they're making of it. You can appreciate the story, but it's very hard to get at facts unless you have independent evidence. That's what the archaeologists were trying to do. But now with the Exodus, and indeed with Genesis generally, they really didn't find any. It's really only after the invasion of Canaan that you begin to get a solid stream of archaeological evidence.
Okay, Professor Collins, if you allow me just 5 seconds, I need to plug the power battery and just come back with you very quick. So I'm going to turn off my camera. Okay, I'm here, just gonna plug it. Give me just a moment. There you go. All right, there you go. That was quick. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Let's move on here. And now this is the following question, people. It's a very thorny topic. And Professor Collins, he is the scholar. He knows what I mean by that. This continues to be a debate even today. Like, this debate is nowhere near, to leave and be settled down anytime soon. So, Professor Collins, what's the documentary hypothesis? Give us an overview.
Now,
And tell us
the
the-
documentary hypothesis, back a couple of 100 years ago already,
okay.
people began to notice that there were different names used for God. So, in Hebrew, you have Yahweh, sometimes transcribed as Jehovah,
Yeah.
or very commonly nowadays, the Lord. And then there's just God.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so at least you have these two quite different ways. And then, you put up there a picture of Julius Wellhausen, who
Yes.
was, to my mind, a really brilliant scholar. Now, he had his prejudices,
Oh, yeah.
no doubt about that. But, he knew how to make an argument.
Hmm.
And he could see contradictions in a text when there were contradictions. Now, he actually kind of came at the end of this process of analyzing the narratives of the Pentateuch. And by the time he kind of then produced the classic account of it, where you had
Mhm.
4 strands. So you had a Yahwist, which most simply calls God Yahweh, even in Genesis, before he has revealed his name, Yahweh. Because in Exodus, then, you read that he reveals his name as Yahweh, and it seems to come as a big surprise. It wasn't known before that. So you have one strand that calls him Yahweh from the beginning. You have another narrative strand that's a lot like the Yahwist in many ways, that we call the Elohist. But then there's yet another one that also calls God, Elohim, but is the easiest one to identify. It's the priestly source. And it's easy to identify because it's preoccupied with rituals, genealogies, and
Yeah.
like the chapter 1 of Genesis, which is, rather cut and dry. God said, let there be light, and there was light. There is very little imaginative elaboration in it. So that's the priestly source. And then Deuteronomy, and now Deuteronomy is a book in itself. Now, as time goes on, people keep picking at things. And there are parts, you see, where the division of the sources works beautifully. And the textbook example is the story of the flood. You could actually take a scissors and cut out the verses that call God Yahweh or the Lord, and the verses that call him God. And you would
Mhm.
get 2 nice, coherent stories that differ consistently on some issues. Now, that's nice. Then you get to the story of the burning bush in Exodus. And you find it becomes quite impossible to do that. And let's see if I can read you a bit of it here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord, that's the other name, appeared to him in the flame of fire out of a bush. And Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight. When the Lord saw that he had turned around to see, God called to him out of the bush and said, come here, Moses. Well, now, if you're trying to make a clean separation between 2 sources, the Lord is one source and God is another, but you're getting them here in the same sentence. So it doesn't all work as smoothly as that. My colleague, Joel Baden, who is, I think, now the reigning expert on this issue, says that
Yeah.
what you've got to do is look at the continuity of the stories. But now, in all fairness, that sometimes leads Joel then even to abandon the criterion of the names in just a few cases. But you have to bend the criteria a little bit to make nice separable stories. I think on the whole that Joel is still right. That there may be a couple of cases where he strains it, but I think what he ends up with are 4 different coherent stories. But now, especially in Europe, there is a tradition of scholarship that examines things in great detail and is very, very concerned with the ongoing rewriting in detail. And so they find things in the early books of the Pentateuch that resemble Deuteronomy. So they say there must be D material in the Pentateuch. Must there be? I'm not really sure.
Not really sure.
It is now fashionable to talk about post-P material. And,
Oh, really?
I've never been quite persuaded of this, but many people are. So we have, I'm afraid, 2 traditions of interpretation. Where I came out on that is I opted for the documentary hypothesis because I think it gives you a readable text.
Okay.
If you can pull out the Yahweh source and you get a more or less coherent theology. And the same with the Elohist. If you are supposing that this is scribes changing a verse here and a verse there, it becomes unintelligible.
Mm-hmm. Makes no sense.
Now, you still couldn't do that if the stories you pulled out weren't coherent. But I think by and large there are. But I would grant you there are problem cases, and there always will be problem cases.
There you go.
I would recommend to any people listening to this, go with the documentary hypothesis. I think
Okay.
it makes better sense of the text.
Okay, that's your suggestion. That's why you're here. Now, I want to say a couple of things. I won't spill the beans, okay, because that's not the purpose of this. But there is a renowned Old Testament scholar, Hebrew scholar, who was interviewed on another show. And when they touched on the composition of the Pentateuch, he said that he's no longer reading nothing that is coming from documentarians, scholars, because he thinks that their scholarship is not coming up with nothing new. And that's pretty much. I'm paraphrasing. I can share the video afterwards, but now that's why it's a debate. And Professor Collins, did you touch on the documentary hypothesis? Is
Oh
something
yeah,
that is
well
coming?
it's the neo-document. That's Joel Baden.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's what you got to go with.
Yeah,
But
I was having a conversation with another guy who has a keen on this stuff, and the documentary hypothesis it's always a go-to topic because of what it implies, And I was like, okay, maybe these are different sources, but the sense of coherence that we can see in the text is because the product of redactors, people editing the text over time. Perhaps I don't know, but that might be one possible theory, But it's right there. That's a debate. Okay.
well, I don't dispute that there are you can recognize some redactional passages and some
Yeah.
passages that are put in, to reconcile tensions in the text.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't, if it were the case that all you had were the redactors, you would still end up with 4 different theologies.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
And, whether those theologies are the product of authors or redactors doesn't really matter all that much.
Okay.
The question is, are they different?
Okay.
Now, you see, I think there's very little dispute about the priestly source. You really need to be blind not to see that. There's little enough dispute about the Deuteronomic source. The main dispute there is whether you can identify some of it in the early chapters. Maybe you can here and there, but I don't think it's a big factor. And most of the dispute has been about the Yahwist and the Elohist. And I think, the reason I go with the neo-documentary hypothesis is that it gives a coherent and persuasive account of a Yahwist theology.
Okay.
So,
very recently, Conrad Schmid and Thomas Dosman, they came up with 2 books in different years from the SBL
yeah.
Press. It's something like Farewell to the Priestly Writing, something like that.
Yeah. I don't think even Conrad believes that. But
Yeah.
I think in fairness, they did put a question mark after.
Okay. What was the question?
Should we bid farewell to the
Should
priest?
be.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah,
Now.
but this is the dilemma of scholarship. There's huge pressure to come up with something new. And so if everybody for 100 years says there were 4 sources in the Pentateuch, then people want to overturn that and make their name by changing scholarship. But changing isn't always for the better.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Is it fair to call it that this is a quagmire? I mean, because people keep going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, I had to deal with it to some degree in my introduction. But I really did not want to get bogged down in it. And I did not want to get into arguing, is this verse J or is it E? Because even Wellhausen didn't always distinguish clearly between J and E.
Now,
So, I think that you come to a point of diminishing returns on that.
Okay.
I think the documentary hypothesis has been useful because, there are obvious tensions in the text.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Yeah.
take the flood story, for example. You can separate 2 stories very easily. And some things are clarified by separating things. But then there are a lot of other cases where it doesn't make that much difference, actually, and where I think maybe the more important questions do not depend on identifying them with a particular source.
Okay. All right. Let's move on here. Thank you, Professor Collins, for addressing that question. The next one practically has to go hand to hand with the documentary hypothesis. What's the Deuteronomic history?
Well, the Deuteronomistic history.
I have issues with that word.
You have a series of historical books, beginning with Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. And as you says, the German scholar Martin Noth, who came up with this, arguing, and I think arguing very persuasively, that the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are all influenced by the book of Deuteronomy.
Okay.
They were all editing history the question was, did people keep the law or did they not? And if then trying to explain what happened by their failure to keep the law in many cases. That's then the explanation for how Israel and Judah get destroyed. Now, that there are differences between the different books. If you read the book of Joshua and the book of Judges, they feel quite differently. And so do the books of Samuel. So you see, I think in each case you have different kinds of source material. And that's what creates the difference between them. But I think the editorial layer is there. And I don't think it's really, there's any good reason to question it. Now, otherwise, the importance of these Deuteronomistic books is that unlike the Pentateuch, you can line these up with other records from the ancient world. And so in this case now, you can correlate the reign of a king of Judah with the reign of a king of Babylon. And at that point, then you have some control over the history. Doesn't mean that everything written in those books actually happened as described, but at least the main outline of it did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There you go. There you go. Is it disputed, Professor Collins, or it's something it's a settled matter in scholars'
I mean,
circles?
I think that's a pretty settled matter. You will always find somebody who questions anything.
Anything.
You will get people who question whether Jesus existed.
Oh yeah.
It doesn't mean that there is any real doubt about the matter. It's just
They continue to do, yeah, they continue. And what's really bothers me, is that people is out there platforming this kind of narratives about whether Jesus existed or not. But anyways, it's free speech. You
yeah.
need to go with that. Thank you for that, Professor Colin. Let's move on here. We're doing good, pretty good with time. So the
Yeah,
fifth
we're running a
question.
little tight on time, and I will need to knock off pretty close to 5 o'clock.
Okay, let's
But
go ahead and say.
let me be quite run through the other questions fairly briefly.
Okay,
Look,
yeah, go
we
ahead.
now have a lot more evidence for prophecy outside of Israel than we used to have. There are a lot of Akkadian texts, Assyrian prophecy. But there's some similarity. The Assyrian prophets tend, in the Hebrew Bible, you have some prophets who more or less work for the king and tell the king what he wants to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And then the distinctive thing in the Hebrew Bible is you have prophets who are critics. Now, as far as I am aware, we don't have the prophets who are critics in the ancient Near East otherwise. You have prophets, who can be consulted. So a king wants to know what's the will of God. If President Trump had lived in the ancient Near East, he would have called in his prophets before he launched an attack on Iran. And they would have told him, yes, Your Majesty, do what is good in your eyes, Your Majesty. Because generally speaking, prophets
Yeah.
do not tell the king what they think he wants to hear. And that is, I think, true of a lot of the ancient Near Eastern prophecy. I would say the prophets are, to my mind, the very best part of the Hebrew Bible. The most distinctive thing about the Hebrew Bible is that the emphasis on justice. You don't get that in any other body of ancient literature. And you get it primarily in the Hebrew prophets. Now, moving from there to the writings.
Yes.
To my mind, the important thing about the writings, everything in the Pentateuch Deuteronomistic history, and even the prophets is all about Israel, all about the history of Israel. Then when you get to Proverbs and Job and Ecclesiastes or Koheleth, you're dealing with humanity as such. This is what we call the wisdom literature. There have been people in recent years who want to deny that there's any such thing as wisdom literature too, and I think that is just perverse. You know, this is the perverse attempt to say something novel at the risk of being stupid. But,
oh, wow.
you know, sorry if I seem indecisive on any of this.
No, that's okay. Go ahead. I know we should do that. Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Yeah. So that, I would say,
And
is the important thing about the writings.
okay,
Is that
thank you.
it gives you material that's concerned with humanity as such and isn't peculiar to Israel.
There you
And
have
now
it.
your last question, I think, was about the canon.
Yeah, actually, it's
And now
right there.
I could go on at some length on this because, you know, I've done a lot of work on the Dead Sea Scrolls.
I know you
And
have.
one of the things in the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they found, you know, copies of what we would call biblical texts from, say, the 1st century BC and even the 1st century of the Common Era, and that these texts often differ a bit from the texts that came down to us. Now, I mean, you can look at this from either side. On the one hand, it's amazing that the text has been preserved as accurately as it has. It's amazing that so much of it corresponds to what came down to us. But there are also other forms of the text in circulation. And you see, what that means is if you come from a tradition that wants to hold to the literal interpretation of the Bible, well, then your question is the literal interpretation of which text? Because the texts differ a bit from each other. Now, you're not going to get a Bible that says the Exodus didn't happen. But you will get a Bible, you know, which differs in smaller details, but not insignificant. The Greek translation of the Bible, which is much older than the Hebrew manuscripts we have from the Middle Ages, often has a different form of the text. In some books, say the book of Jeremiah, or the book, it's much shorter. Well, now, in some of these cases, there were texts found in the Dead Sea Scrolls in Hebrew that corresponded to the Greek, which shows, you know, the text had not been finalized in the time of Jesus. It was probably in the century after Jesus that they really got serious about nailing down one form of the text.
So you're saying that there wasn't a closed canon in the time of Jesus?
Right. There was not a closed canon in the time of Jesus. Now, in the time of Jesus, everybody thought the books of Moses were inspired, yes, and that the prophets were inspired. It isn't clear that they all agreed on what books of prophets there were. Was Daniel a prophet? You see, in the Hebrew Bible, Daniel isn't in the prophets. It's in the writings. And there were other books in circulation in the name of Enoch, for example, that some people accepted as prophecy. But the most important thing is that scribes were still working on the text. And one of the things they do, you know, is try to resolve differences and smooth out the text. And you can see that was still going on in the time of Jesus.
Well, you know, I've heard
that's a good nugget to leave you with.
Yes, thank you. No, I just going to say that Emmanuel Tilba has come up with this that we should better talk about the originals.
Yeah.
Yes, at the end. So that kind of matches what you're saying. Professor Collins, thank you. Everybody out there, perhaps some of you might say, oh, okay, but I want more from Professor Collins. Hey, they got they got plenty of time, but they need to share with their family, their own schedules. They have a lot of things to do, so
Yeah.
that's why it's even more. Yeah, something that we need to thank for his making some time for us. But at least this is an overview, something that you can just bring it to your own, do your own homework. Get the book. I'm gonna be leaving the link right there so you can get your own book on Amazon or whatever shop of your preference. So, Professor Collins, any final comments before we leave it?
No, but I encourage people to show them again the link for this conference, so called,
Oh,
on
do you want me to
March
show it again?
20th to 22nd.
Yes.
There'll be a
Let me,
lot
let
of
me,
good stuff in that.
yes. Yeah, 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 yeah. People need to know about this, and that's why we're here to promote what is going on out there with the scholars and what they are doing for the public. So, let me see right here. Where are you? Okay, there you go. Here. I think it's this one. Oh, no, it's not this one. Okay, there you go. Oh, 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 oh. Not giving me. It's not giving me the option, which is weird. It should. Let's see. Oh, there you go. YouTube. Oh, there you go. Okay. Let me know if you can see it there on your screen, people. And this is basically uh, there you
Yeah.
go. New insights into the Hebrew Bible. So there's the lineup. You can check out that on Bob Ehrman's social media. This is going to take place on from March 20th through 22nd. And you can see big names right there, of which Professor Collins is going to be a part of. So please go there, learn. Never stop learning. We need to keep learning. And thank God that we have these people doing the hard work for us. So, with that in mind, Professor Collins and myself, we say goodbye. It will be until the next time. Take
Good to
care
talk to
now.
you.
Bye
Bye.
bye now.